My dream vacation to Rome ended the second I realized my travel agent hadn't sold me a tour, but a carefully timed diversion for international criminals. Now I'm running from the police, the culprits, and the ghost who just pulled me from an Italian prison cell. The smell of stale coffee and cheap cologne clung to Marco's office like a shroud. It was supposed to be the start of the best vacation of my life. Rome. Ancient stones, sun-drenched piazzas, and a 2-week escape from the soul-crushing grind of my accounting job. I'd paid Marco a king's ransom, premium flights, a boutique hotel near the Pantheon, private tours scheduled down to the minute. He was the best, they said, an artist of itineraries. "Everything is perfect, Leo," Marco had beamed, sliding the thick, leather-bound folder across his mahogany desk 2 weeks ago. His smile was too wide, his handshake too firm. "First class all the way. You won't lift a finger. Just enjoy la dolce vita." I believed him. I was naive, I suppose. Naive enough to trust a man who looked like he'd stepped out of a bad 90s movie, complete with a gold pinky ring and an almost too perfect tan, even in the dead of a drizzly November. The problem started immediately upon landing at Fiumicino. My supposedly reserved first-class transfer was nowhere to be found. After an hour of panicked searching and failing language skills, I managed to flag down a grimy, expensive taxi. The boutique hotel near the Pantheon? A crumbling tenement building that looked less boutique and more condemned. The reservation receipt Marco gave me was printed on what felt suspiciously like thermal printer paper from a gas station. I spent the first 48 hours in a cycle of desperate phone calls and mounting fury. Marco's office line went straight to a disconnected message. His mobile number? Ringing, 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 until it finally went to a full voicemail box. I was stranded. I used the emergency credit card, ate questionable street food, and started walking, trying to soak up the culture, despite the knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach. On the third night, I found a small, dimly lit trattoria far from the tourist traps. I ordered pasta and nursed a glass of cheap local wine, trying to figure out how to contact my bank and cancel everything without my passport, which, thankfully, was still secure in my backpack. That's when I saw the photograph tacked haphazardly to a corkboard near the exit, a community board for local events, mostly dog-walking notices and job postings for cleaning crews. Tucked between an ad for guitar lessons and a flyer for a lost cat, there was a grainy, black-and-white police notice. It was in Italian, but the language barrier didn't matter for the faces. My blood ran cold. The 2 men staring back at me weren't local petty criminals. They were notorious figures in the international financial news. Men I'd only ever seen plastered across business journals, accused of orchestrating massive cross-border corporate espionage and complex fraud schemes that had cost governments billions. They were international fugitives, wanted in 6 countries, and they looked exactly like the 2 large, impeccably dressed men who had been sitting at the corner booth in that trattoria when I walked in. I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. They hadn't noticed me. They were deeply involved in a hushed, intense conversation with the owner, gesturing over crumpled papers. Panic surged, but survival instinct kicked in faster. I put down my fork, subtly pulled my backpack onto my lap, and tried to look like I was just staring thoughtfully at the wine list. My mind raced back to Marco. Why were those wanted men in the same low-rent establishment where Marco's supposed perfect itinerary had routed me? I excused myself to the restroom, but instead I slipped out the back door into a narrow, damp alleyway smelling of garbage and ammonia. I needed to get out of there, fast. I started jogging silently toward the main street, my heart hammering against my ribs, the cheap wine tasting like acid in my throat. I made it maybe 50 yards down the alley when I heard heavy footsteps echoing behind me. Too fast, too purposeful. "Leo Rossi," a deep voice barked, not in Italian, but in perfect, clipped English. I didn't look back. I broke into a dead sprint, weaving between overflowing bins. I rounded a corner onto a slightly busier, dimly lit street, hoping for a taxi or a brightly lit shop, anything that suggested witnesses. Suddenly, a large, gloved hand clamped down hard on my shoulder, spinning me around. It was one of the men from the trattoria, the taller one with the scar tracing his jawline. His eyes were chips of granite. The other man was right behind him, blocking my only path back. "Marco sends his regards," the man hissed, his breath smelling faintly of expensive cigarettes. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly inconvenienced, like I was a misplaced piece of luggage. "I don't know who Marco is," I stammered, pulling uselessly against his grip. "I just booked a vacation." The tall man smiled, a cold, mirthless gesture. He reached into his tailored jacket. I braced myself for the worst, for the illegal weaponry I'd only read about in connection with these types of organized schemes. But what he pulled out was a flimsy piece of paper. It was my hotel confirmation, the one Marco had printed. "Marco knows exactly who you are, Mr. Rossi," the second man said, stepping closer. "You see, the reservation wasn't for you. It was the drop location, and you were the package that arrived early." My legs felt weak. "Drop location? What are you talking about?" The first man leaned in close, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial murmur that somehow made the situation infinitely more terrifying. "Marco didn't sell you a vacation, Leo. He sold us a distraction. A convenient, loud, very traceable American tourist to cover the transfer of some sensitive materials through the city while the real clients arrived. Your hotel reservation was booked under an alias that conveniently shares 3 digits with the routing number for the money transfer we needed to complete tonight. Marco was paid very well to ensure you checked in, stayed put, and made enough noise for the local authorities to focus on an annoyed tourist rather than the actual movement." "But I never checked in," I whispered, realizing the horror of my own panicked wandering. "Exactly. Which means you are now uncontained, traceable, and carrying a backpack full of personal data that might accidentally link back to us when the inevitable check-in failure report comes through." The man sighed dramatically. "Marco wasn't supposed to let you run free. He was supposed to deliver you to the safe house under the pretense of sorting out your booking error tomorrow morning. Now we have a problem." The tall man shifted his grip, his hand moving from my shoulder down to my collar. He wasn't asking me to come along. He was collecting me. I slammed my elbow back instinctively, connecting with something hard but yielding. His ribs, perhaps. He grunted, momentarily loosening his hold. It was the only chance I'd get. I twisted violently, ripping my jacket free, and bolted again, not into the street, but deeper into the labyrinth of the back alleys. I could hear them shouting now, the sound echoing off the ancient brickwork, their footsteps heavier, faster. I rounded one final corner, convinced I was clear, only to slam directly into a solid wall of uniforms. 3 figures in dark jackets bearing the insignia of Italian national law enforcement materialized out of the shadows. They weren't looking at me, though. They were staring past me, down the alley I'd just fled. "Freeze!" one of them yelled, drawing a sidearm. But it wasn't me they were interested in. The 2 men who had cornered me burst around the previous corner, skidding to a halt as they saw the uniformed officers aimed directly at them. "They're not who you think they are," the scarred man shouted in panicked Italian, throwing his hands up. One of the officers, a stern-faced woman, didn't hesitate. She glanced at the fugitives, then her eyes snapped to me, standing there shaking, looking like a lost, terrified tourist directly between 2 known international persons of interest. "You," she commanded, pointing her weapon straight at my chest. "Step away from the suspects. Now." I raised my hands immediately, confusion and terror warring within me. I wasn't the crook. I was the victim of a travel scam. But looking at the cold steel of the weapon and the grim determination on the officer's face, I knew instantly that in this moment, under the flickering Roman street lamp, I looked exactly like the accomplice the travel agent had sold out to the highest bidder. My hands were shaking so violently I thought my arms might vibrate right off my shoulders. "Wait, officer, please. I'm Leo Rossi. I'm an American tourist. I was just running from those two." I pointed frantically at the men who were now being roughly subdued and cuffed by the other two officers. The female officer kept her weapon trained on me, her expression unreadable. Tourists don't usually flee into dead-end alleys seconds before being detained alongside international fugitives. Face the wall, hands where I can see them. The betrayal was a physical punch. Marco hadn't just sold me out. He'd set me up as the perfect patsy. I was the convenient loose end, the distraction who conveniently ended up in the crosshairs of the police, while the real players got caught, potentially framing me for whatever transfer had been supposed to happen. As I slowly turned, placing my palms against the cold, grimy brick, I heard muffled arguments in Italian and the harsh, metallic sound of handcuffs clicking shut. "Who are you working with, Rossi?" the officer demanded, circling me slowly. "The booking agent? Marco Santini? We've been tracking his activity for months, but he's slippery." "I don't know him," I insisted, my voice cracking. "He runs a travel agency back home. I paid him thousands for a luxury trip. I never meant to meet anyone." I felt a hand roughly patting down my jacket, then the sharp yank as my backpack was pulled from my shoulders. I heard the zipper tearing slightly as they aggressively searched it. They pulled out my passport, my wallet, my phone. "Leo Rossi," the officer read, looking at my driver's license. "Accountant, Milwaukee. Clean record." She sounded unconvinced. "Then explain why your hotel confirmation, which we located in the trash a block from here, was booked under a shell corporation known to be used by the people you were just associating with." My mind raced. The Shell Corporation. Marco must have used a known front to book the fake hotel, tying my legitimate identity, which he must have illegally obtained, to a known criminal entity. "It was a fake booking. He scammed me. I only realized when I got there," I pleaded. The officer paused, looking down at my now empty backpack, then back at the two handcuffed fugitives who were being aggressively questioned by the other officers nearby. The scarred man glared at me with pure, incandescent hatred before being shoved into the back of a plain, dark sedan that had pulled up silently to the alley entrance. "Agent Bianchi," one of the other officers called out, approaching the woman holding me. "They aren't talking. They're demanding consular assistance. They claim they were intercepted during a legitimate business meeting." Bianchi grunted, not taking her eyes off me. "Legitimate business involving international warrants? Take them downtown. I'll deal with this lost lamb." She turned back to me, her stance softening infinitesimally, but the weapon remained close. "Mr. Rossi, you are currently being detained as a material witness in an investigation concerning organized schemes involving economic sabotage and obstruction of justice. We need to verify your story completely. You come with us." I was led out of the alley and into the harsh glare of streetlights. The sight of the unmarked sedan speeding away with the two villains inside cemented my terror. They were gone. The primary witnesses to Marco's scam were now in custody, and I was next in line, caught in the crossfire. The police station was chaotic and smelled of stale cigarettes and desperation. I was separated, questioned for hours by different officers who cycled through, each one starting from scratch, each one more skeptical than the last. I gave them Marco's details, the payment receipts, everything. They ran the name. Nothing registered in their immediate databases, except for a small, defunct import-export business that had dissolved 5 years prior. Finally, I was left alone in a small, windowless interrogation room. Hours passed. My throat was raw from talking. I was exhausted, jet-lagged, and terrified of what an accusation of obstruction or association with those criminals might mean back home. Just as I was starting to drift into a worried stupor, the door opened, and Agent Bianchi walked in, this time without the firearm drawn, but carrying a thick, official-looking file. She sat down opposite me and slid the file open. "We ran a deep dive on Marco Santini," she said, her voice flat. "The name is common. We found a few possibilities, but nothing concrete tying any of them to the scale of fraud you're describing. The agency you paid? It seems to have been dissolved legally. No outstanding debts or warrants linked to its former proprietor. But the transaction went through, I protested. My bank statement proves it. We have that, she conceded, tapping the file. But the receiving account in Malta? It was closed yesterday morning, right after the final installment cleared. It was a clean drain, Leo. It looks like a perfect con designed to look like a high-stakes exchange gone wrong. She leaned forward, her gaze intense. Here's the problem, Mr. Rossi. The two individuals we apprehended, they were indeed major targets. They were on a tight schedule. They were expecting a package, not a tourist. When they were intercepted, their immediate, panicked assumption was that you were the backup operative sent by their rivals, and that Marco Santini had betrayed them by sending an amateur to disrupt their operation. I don't know what they were moving, I insisted, my voice rising again. I was looking for a shower. Bianchi stood up abruptly, gathering the papers. We have processed your prints. For now, you're being held pending further investigation into possible connections to international financial crimes. We can't just let you walk out, Leo. You were physically present at the scene of an apprehension involving high-value targets. She paused at the door, and I felt a dizzying wave of hopelessness wash over me. I was trapped in a foreign jail cell, branded a co-conspirator because a scam artist sold my itinerary to men who moved billions. If you cooperate fully, she continued, her voice barely audible, we might be able to prove you were simply an extremely unfortunate target of a wider plot. But if we find anything at all, linking your activity to that shell corporation or those men, we will charge you. And trust me, facing an accusation related to that kind of heavy international financial violation here in Italy is not a pleasant experience. The door clicked shut, plunging me back into silence. I slumped back in the hard plastic chair, defeated. I was alone, hours away from home, about to face an extradition nightmare, or worse, all because I trusted a man with a gold pinky ring. Then, the overhead light in the room flickered once, twice, and died completely, plunging the cell into absolute darkness. A second later, I heard a faint, high-pitched whine, the unmistakable sound of electronics being manipulated, followed by a soft click from the steel door. The internal lock had just disengaged. I held my breath, heart pounding. Was this the police? Or was this Marco making his final, terrifying cleanup move? Slowly, cautiously, the heavy door creaked open just a crack, revealing not the harsh fluorescent light of the corridor, but the deep, inky blackness of the facility hallway, broken only by a single, weak emergency exit sign glowing red down the passage. And standing there, silhouetted against the faint red glow, was a familiar, too-wide smile. The silhouette against the emergency exit sign was instantly recognizable, even in the gloom. That absurdly wide, predatory smile, the gold ring glinting faintly in the low light. It was Marco. Leo, my favorite client. Marco's voice was low, smooth, and sickeningly cheerful, completely devoid of the panic that should accompany someone breaking into a national police facility. I apologize for the unexpected change in itinerary. Sometimes the best vacations require a little detour. I scrambled up from the chair, adrenaline overriding exhaustion. Marco, they think I'm involved. You set me up. You sold my data to those criminals. He stepped fully into the room, looking perfectly tailored even in the dark, holding a small, sleek electronic device in one hand. Sold? Such harsh language, Leo. I merely facilitated a complex logistical arrangement. Think of it as an aggressive form of cross-promotion. You were the perfect distraction while the main players were being intercepted. It guaranteed maximum police focus away from the real objective. And what was the real objective? I demanded, backing away until my shoulders hit the wall behind the chair. Marco sighed, shaking his head with performative disappointment. You're an accountant, Leo. You deal in numbers that are safely filed away. You don't understand the flow of real capital. The objective wasn't the arrests. The objective was the timing of the arrests. My employers needed a very specific window of chaos to finalize a transaction. He tapped the small device in his hand. And thanks to your highly visible, slightly panicked presence near the drop zone, that window was wide open. "Why are you here?" I whispered, glancing desperately at the now unlocked door, expecting an alarm to blare any second. "To rescue my investment, of course," Marco chirped. "You are proof of concept, Leo. If I can successfully manipulate a middle-class accountant from Milwaukee into providing cover for an international manhunt, imagine what I can do with genuine high-level assets. You are too valuable to be wasted in an Italian jail cell, being questioned about things you don't understand." He took a step toward me. Agent Bianchi and her team were excellent props, by the way. Very theatrical, but ultimately predictable. They focused on the men they knew were wanted, rather than the man they didn't know. "What do you want from me?" I asked, trying to sound steady. "Nothing much," Marco said, gesturing toward the door. "Just a temporary alliance. We need to disappear before the morning shift arrives and real forensic investigation begins. You are the key to accessing your own travel funds, which I cleverly routed through a series of accounts that only you can verify from the outside. Think of it as a very high-stakes escrow arrangement." He held out his hand. "You come with me now, and I guarantee you'll be on a flight back to the States by dawn, a little poorer, very shaken, but entirely free of any official entanglement regarding those radicals or the complex financial maneuvers you accidentally witnessed. Refuse, and you stay here, facing charges that will make your old accounting firm look like a Sunday school picnic." The choice was horrifyingly clear. Stay and rot, or trust the devil who had already sold me out once. "If I go with you," I said slowly, "I want proof. I want the original booking confirmations showing I was defrauded, and I want a verifiable line of communication to my embassy once we are clear." Marco laughed, a dry, hacking sound. "You still think in terms of paperwork, Leo? Adorable. Fine, I'll get you a flight. But first, we need to leave this little hospitality suite." He stepped aside, gesturing down the darkened hallway. I hesitated for only a second, taking in the silence. The lack of sirens, the absence of shouting. It suggested Marco either had incredible control over this facility or had been waiting for this exact moment to slip away. Taking a deep breath, I walked past him and into the hall. The red glow of the exit sign illuminated dust motes dancing in the stale air. We moved quickly, Marco leading the way with an unnerving familiarity, weaving through darkened offices and past locked supply closets. We reached a set of emergency exit doors leading to a loading dock area. Marco worked his electronic device again, and with a soft thunk, the magnetic lock released. A blast of cold, damp night air hit my face. Freedom, perhaps? Or just a different kind of trap? "Our transport is just around the corner," Marco murmured as we stepped out onto the wet concrete. A simple white van, perfectly inconspicuous. Nothing like the luxury sedan those thugs were using. We rounded the corner of the building. There was indeed a white van parked under the weak sodium light of the exterior lamps. But standing beside the open sliding door, waiting for us, wasn't a driver. It was Agent Bianchi. And she wasn't alone. 2 more plainclothes officers flanked her, all armed. Bianchi didn't look surprised. She looked deeply satisfied. "Looking for a ride, Marco?" she called out, her voice echoing in the industrial space. "We let you bring your little distraction out, just like we planned." Marco froze instantly. His cheerful facade shattered, replaced by stark, raw fear. He spun around, looking back toward the police station door we'd just exited. Who called you?" Marco stammered, fumbling with the electronic device, which now seemed like a useless trinket. Bianchi smiled, but it held none of the warmth of Marco's pretense. "You were right about one thing, Marco. You were excellent at manipulating logistics, but you forgot the first rule of deep cover. Never trust the person who sets up the drop location. We've been tracking your activity, not Santini's. When you signaled for the lock to disengage, that was our cue. She took a slow step forward. And Leo? You aren't a patsy. You're the bait that brought the shark to the surface. We have everything we need now, especially the digital trail you generated trying to access your bank account from the interrogation room. Marco looked wildly between the heavily armed officers and me, the scared tourist who had just inadvertently led them straight to him. He looked cornered. "You can't keep me," Marco spat, desperation lending his voice a sudden sharp edge. He lunged, not toward the officers, but toward me, the closest, weakest link. He shoved me hard toward Bianchi, yelling in Italian, "Take the tourist! He's the real operative!" The move was clumsy, desperate. Bianchi and her men tensed, momentarily thrown off balance by the sudden explosion of action between their intended prisoner and their star witness. In that split second of confusion, Marco bolted, not toward the van or the main exit, but toward a high perimeter fence at the edge of the dockyard, an area too dark to see clearly. "Stop him!" Bianchi roared, shoving me roughly toward the building wall for cover. But Marco was already halfway there, agile despite his expensive suit. As he reached the fence, a dark shape detached itself from the shadows beyond the chain links, a figure too large, too fast for an ordinary dock worker. Before Marco could even touch the metal, the figure moved with startling speed, intercepting him with a brutal, silent tackle that sent both men crashing into the chain link. There was a sickening crunch, and then nothing. The second figure stood up slowly, dusted off its dark, unremarkable jacket, and then turned its head directly toward Agent Bianchi and me, standing frozen in the weak light. It wasn't Marco. It was one of the fugitives they had supposedly arrested and put in the sedan hours ago, and he was holding a large, dark piece of illegal weaponry pointed directly at the police. The silence that followed the sickening impact of the tackle was heavier than the concrete beneath my feet. The fugitive, the one they called the Scarred Man, stood over Marco's crumpled form. He wasn't just holding a piece of illegal weaponry. It was a serious, modern firearm, utterly out of place in this messy arrest scene. Agent Bianchi's training kicked in instantly. She shoved me harder against the cold brick, putting her own body between me and the alley mouth. "Down! Stay down!" she yelled, raising her sidearm toward the threat. The two junior officers, who had been momentarily paralyzed by the realization that their primary targets had somehow escaped custody and were now armed, reacted a half-second too late, fumbling for their own weapons. "Get on the radio! We need backup at the loading bay! Now!" Bianchi barked, her voice tight with adrenaline and fury. She fired a warning shot into the ground near the fugitive's feet. Sparks flew from the concrete. The fugitive ignored it. He stepped over Marco's unmoving body, his eyes locked onto Bianchi. He spoke, not shouting, but in a voice that carried chilling authority, completely calm despite the chaos. "The sedan was never going downtown, Agent. Amateur move. You think we'd let you simply drive our leverage away?" Leverage. That was me. That was Marco. I realized with a sickening lurch that the entire sequence, the escape from the interrogation room, Marco appearing with the electronic key, Bianchi's perfectly timed ambush, was orchestrated by them. They had allowed the police to pick up the cleaners, the men who had been in the trattoria, to give the authorities a false sense of success, all while planning to recapture the essential components: Marco, the facilitator, and me, the accidental data carrier. Marco hadn't set me up to be a distraction for them. He had been set up by them to be caught by the police, only to be rescued by the police's own perceived success, leading him right back into their hands. It was a circle of deception so complex it made my head spin. "You're too late," Bianchi retorted, reloading her weapon with practiced speed. We secured the digital components of your entire operation hours ago when we brought in your associates." The fugitive smiled that same cold, granite smile I'd seen earlier. "Did you? Did you secure the key to the Cayman account, Agent? Or did you just secure the key to a very expensive, very empty decoy server?" He gestured vaguely with the weapon toward the darkness behind him. Marco was a necessary casualty of bad operational security. He sold information to the wrong people. But you, Agent Bianchi, you are the unexpected prize. Before Bianchi could respond, before I could even fully process the fact that my rescuer was now my enemy, the fugitive pulled the trigger. The sound of the high-caliber weapon firing was deafening in the enclosed space. It wasn't aimed at Bianchi. It was aimed at the ground between my feet. The impact sent me sprawling sideways, the force throwing me hard against the rough wall. My head struck the brick with a painful thud, and the world swam into fractured colors. The two junior officers, finally reacting, opened fire blindly toward the silhouette. Shots pinged off the metal siding of the loading bay, the air filled with the smell of cordite and adrenaline. I tried to crawl away, dazed, tasting blood in my mouth. When my vision cleared enough to focus, I saw Bianchi had dropped low, using a stack of wooden pallets as cover, exchanging sporadic fire with the single, highly effective operative. But the real horror was Marco. He hadn't moved since the tackle. He was lying half-sprawled beneath the fence line, utterly still. The fugitive hadn't retreated. He was advancing slowly, methodically, keeping his weapon leveled, using the incoming fire from Bianchi's team as cover to close the distance. He was playing a game of chicken, waiting for the inevitable moment when the police ammunition ran low, or when one of the junior officers made a fatal error. And then I saw it. Just past the fugitive's feet, almost hidden in the deep shadow where Marco lay, was another figure. Small, low to the ground. As the fugitive stepped over Marco, the smaller figure lunged, fast and silent as a snake. It wasn't armed with a firearm. It was armed with something metallic and gleaming. The smaller figure slashed upward at the ankle of the advancing fugitive. The larger man let out a strangled cry of pain and surprise, his carefully maintained stance breaking. The illegal firearm clattered onto the concrete. The fugitive stumbled, momentarily dropping his guard as he clutched his leg. This was my opening. My heart hammered a rhythm of pure, desperate survival. I didn't know who the third actor was, a rival criminal network, a conscience-stricken employee of Marco's. It didn't matter. I launched myself from my hiding spot, scrambling across the ground toward the fallen firearm, propelled by a terror so intense it felt like fire in my muscles. I snatched the heavy weapon. It felt cold, alien, and terrifyingly powerful in my trembling hands. I didn't aim carefully. I didn't know how to aim. I just pointed the muzzle in the general direction of the closest threat, the charging fugitive, who was now roaring in pain and fury, trying to recover his weapon. I squeezed the trigger. The recoil slammed into my shoulder, raw and unexpected, nearly knocking me back down. The sound was immense, but there was no immediate impact. I had missed. However, the shot, fired by a terrified accountant, had done something else entirely. It hadn't hit the armed man. It had struck the electrical box mounted on the loading bay wall right beside Agent Bianchi's head. Sparks erupted in a violent, blinding cascade. The overhead sodium lamp sputtered and died completely. The entire loading dock was plunged into absolute, crushing darkness. The only light came from the distant, sporadic red glow of the emergency exit sign far down the hall, and the muzzle flashes from the junior officer's panicked return fire. In the sudden, total blackness, all coordinated action ceased. I was lying on the cold, wet concrete, holding a foreign weapon I barely understood, with two separate armed groups, the police and the unknown figures who had just emerged, fighting blindly in the dark around me. I heard a scream, definitely not Bianchi's, followed by the terrifying sound of heavy boots running not toward the exit, but deeper into the industrial complex, away from the police perimeter. Then a hand, not the rough grip of the police, but a smaller, surprisingly delicate hand, grabbed my arm in the darkness and pulled me sharply sideways, dragging me away from the gunfire, toward the fence where the silent struggle had taken place. "If you want to live, you move now," a strained female voice hissed directly into my ear, speaking rapid-fire Italian I barely understood, but the urgency was universal. "And drop that thing!" The grip on my arm was surprisingly strong for the small frame I sensed, pulling me blindly away from the deafening muzzle flashes and the desperate shouts of Agent Bianchi. I let the heavy illegal weapon slip from my numb fingers, the clatter swallowed instantly by the sounds of the chaotic firefight erupting behind us. I didn't know who this person was, the third party, the one who had taken down the armed fugitive, but at this moment they were the only thing separating me from either the police or the remnants of Marco's sinister network. "Wait! Who are you?" I gasped, stumbling as I was dragged low, crawling on hands and knees under the cover of the industrial shadows. "No time for names," she hissed back in Italian, her voice rough, laced with fatigue. "They have eyes everywhere. Bianchi's team is contained, but they're about to realize the true package escaped." We scrambled under the wreckage of the downed fugitive and over the still heavy form of Marco, whose betrayal had finally caught up to him. The sheer audacity of the situation, running through a police lockdown zone, guided by an unknown ally who seemed to know the layout better than the guards, was beyond comprehension. We reached the perimeter fence. It was the same fence the fugitive had been trying to clear. My guide didn't hesitate. She didn't try to climb. Instead, she pulled a small, specialized cutting tool from her jacket, and within seconds, a section of the chain link near the bottom was peeled back just enough for us to slide through. We tumbled out onto a deserted street, the harsh sounds of the police confrontation fading rapidly behind the thick concrete walls of the loading bay. We were in a maze of old warehouses, far from the city center. My rescuer finally stopped, leaning against a damp brick wall, breathing heavily. When I looked at her, the emergency exit light provided just enough illumination to make out her features. She was young, pale, and wearing practical, dark clothing. She wasn't a police officer. She looked like someone who had been living in the shadows for a long time. "Who are you working for?" I managed, my voice hoarse. She shook her head, pulling a thin scarf higher over her nose. "I work for the people who clean up messes like Marco Santini. He wasn't just selling vacation packages, Leo. He was laundering data access points for a global information brokerage network, the same one those fugitives were trying to escape. Marco thought he was playing both sides for profit. He wasn't. He was just an expendable pawn for the network that owned him." "The fugitives, they were trying to escape the network?" "They were trying to steal their exit strategy," she corrected grimly. "They thought they could hijack the access codes Marco was using to funnel sensitive data out of Europe. When they realized Marco had already handed those codes over to the authorities, to Bianchi's unit, essentially, they turned on him immediately. That's why they were so happy to see him captured earlier." "And you?" "I was there to retrieve the data transfer files that Marco had hidden when he realized the police were closing in on him. When you came barreling out of that interrogation room, you were the noise we needed to make Bianchi move her focus off the main objective, which was the digital footprint he left behind." She pointed back toward the direction of the station. "The police think they have the culprits locked up, but they only have the distractions. The real evidence, the real money, is still in transit, controlled by the network that Marco worked for." She pulled out a burner phone and tapped a single button. It lit up, showing a single, non-geographic number. "Here is what you do, Leo Rossi. You go to the nearest open, brightly lit public area, a 24-hour cafe, a major hotel lobby. You use your own money, call your bank, and report your entire identity compromised. You tell them you were robbed, mugged, and that all subsequent transactions must be halted immediately. You do not mention Italy, police, or Fugitives. You just burn your entire digital life down. What about me? I asked, feeling the weight of the last 3 days crashing down. What about the police? They think I'm a material witness, maybe even an accomplice. She studied me, her expression softening slightly. The Yankees unit is currently too busy managing the chaos you accidentally caused. The escaped radicals, the armed confrontation, the dead body of their informant, to focus on an accountant who has conveniently vanished. They will classify you as a terrified tourist who fled in panic during a violent raid. It's plausible enough to slow down any immediate pursuit. She handed me a single crisp $100 bill. Take a cab to the airport early tomorrow morning. You fly home. You don't talk about Rome. You don't check your accounts for 6 months. You become boring again. If you ever see Marco Santini's name or hear about high-level financial schemes, you walk away immediately. You are now officially a ghost. I stared at the money, then at the dark maze surrounding us. I had been sold out, nearly framed, nearly killed, and then unexpectedly saved by a shadow operative who worked for the people cleaning up the mess left by the people who weren't the mess. "And you?" I asked. She gave a curt nod toward the dark warehouses. "I have to retrieve the files Marco hid before the network realizes they need to send someone else to sweep the area. And I have to make sure no one ever connects the dots back to the accountant who stumbled into the wrong itinerary." With that, she turned and melted back into the darkness between the warehouses, moving with an almost supernatural silence, leaving me standing alone under the faint glow of a distant street lamp. The sounds of emergency sirens were finally starting to approach the police compound, but they wouldn't find me. I was heading for the airport, my vacation budget gone, my nerves shredded, but alive, an accountant who had briefly, terrifyingly, brushed against the true underworld of global finance, and somehow, against all odds, managed to escape being shredded along with it.